This is Paul at Focus Pulling, and this video is an overview of the new Bestview R7 on-location camera monitor that you can add for a brighter and larger auxiliary display to what you're shooting with your digital cinema camera. The Bestview R7 has a 1920 by 1200 resolution, giving a little more room than a standard HD or UHD aspect ratio. And the nits of brightness are at 1000, which is about double or even a little more than double than the average monitor we've been used to in the past. Those are the key features, but I kind of will stop there because it's not my jam to read off to you a list of specs like all other videos seem to these days that you can probably just read faster on paper or on screen than me rattling through each one. So the purpose of this video, to distinguish from others, is really just to leave no stone unturned and to go through all of the menu items, functions, capabilities, and occasional lack of capabilities of this product. And then in the meantime, exploring a lot of the principles of why we use these things and how they can be useful for us as we shoot cinema. So to begin with, this Bestview R7 monitor is receiving right now, just to get the lay of the land, a UHD image from a Sony a7 III, and it's outputting a clean HDMI signal. And as such, as a clean HDMI signal, it's also giving us the S-Log3 Cine Gamma color space. And so maybe the first thing we should do is to get our image looking the way it does in normal Rec. 709 video playback, which is a good idea to do while we're in the field even, watching through this monitor, because we really want to see how things will ultimately look in the end when it comes to issues like color and exposure. So our first step, jumping ahead to some of the more advanced functions of this monitor, is to swipe anywhere on screen. And so I'll go out of that and back, where you'll see in the manual, if you read it, that officially they want you to swipe from the left in to get to the menus. But as you saw at first, one of the great features of this product is that it actually will take any swiping movement anywhere on the visible screen and interpret that to mean that you want to go to the menus. And then you tap once anywhere in the image to leave, okay? So we're going into the menus, but we're going to the LUT config category. And what we see here is something we'll unfortunately need to get acquainted with as we get familiar with this product, which is the way that it will always describe close, or we'll use the word close to mean off and open to mean on or activated, as opposed to closing this menu category and moving on to another one. Not what it means. So understanding that it means open, if I press open, it's applying right now something that's totally inapplicable. It says Bestview Rec. 70933. I have no idea what that means, but it's the default LUT that comes with the monitor out of the box system reset. But what the trick is that we need to press custom LUT USB to then proceed to activate this look USB. And what needs to happen then is that we need to have connected the USB thumb drive that comes for free in the package that already has preloaded onto it the things that you see in this sort of mini OS. It's not nearly as robust as the so-called Atom OS, for example, that you find on Atomos products, but it is a file system navigation tool where we want to go find something. Now, the goal of this monitor in a typical workflow is not to look at things in a particularly looks-applied manner, where you would then, you would try out the Dave Fincher spooky blue look of a certain type of scene. We don't want to be doing that in the field. We want to be doing that in post-production. So all we really want is log conversions. And then the other good news is that the thumb drive that comes with the product has really almost all of the mainstream camera LUT conversions to Rec. 709 that you would ever probably have. And so we see a wide variety here, including Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera, which is what I'm, by the way, shooting this whole video with. I'm shooting the monitor and my occasional fingers in the way with the Blackmagic 4K. So we have that LUT. And you see some Canon products and so on. What we're navigating for is, I told you earlier that my source that's being fed into here in clean HDMI is Sony S-Log3. Minor criticism, tiny nuance that's barely visible is the fact that I'm actually sending the Cinegamut variants of S-Log3, which isn't going to look a lot different, but if they were thorough, they would include 2 different S-Log3 LUTs, but okay, fine. So I'm selecting it, and then when I double tap it, you can see a little check mark there. If I hadn't loaded that into the camera, it would download it. So I'll show you what that looks like. If I go here and I double tap this, you can see the line going up, and it's slowly downloading it. And once it's eligible for also getting a check mark, then I could do that, right? There, it's checked. I'm actually going to uncheck that. Or actually, it's checked because it's able to be loaded up. But anyways, what I was interested is in making sure that the S-Log3 LUT is available with the check mark, confirms it. And then I want to navigate up to the top and quit USB with a double. And now I'm back at the main menus. Second critique. It actually turns out that whenever you do swipe to go to the menus, it always takes you down to the bottom menu and never back to where you were. So something that would be nice in a firmware update, which is actually possible through this product. The same USB drive that was used to import LUTs is the same drive port that you can use to import firmware updates and apply them. So it seems possible to me, and maybe likely, that some of the issues that I'll very lightly complain about will be addressed in the future. But as for this, second point on the thumb drive, by the way, is that once you do import a LUT, it's internal, and you don't have to have the USB drive inconveniently connected all the time. So no confusion there. Let's go back to that LUT config menu. And we don't need to go back to the USB drive again because we already did that thing. But now we have a pop-up menu here. It's currently on, but it's applying this mysterious bad LUT that's not relevant to S-Log3. But if I tap this, sure enough, I can go to S-Log3, double tap, and now I have it applied. And you can see what it did to the image, right? It really made it do all the things that converting from flat log to Rec 709 does, right? So it's punchy, the saturation is back to normal, the shadows are punched down, the highlights are controlled, and so on. So all good. So let's get out of there, and again, to remind you, it's not pressing close because that would actually turn off the applicability of the menu category. We're leaving it open, but we're going back to what was promised. So this video will tediously, as I often do, go through every single nook and cranny of every single thing that the device can do. So it's sort of mostly a tutorial rather than some subjective review. So for what it's worth. And when it comes to that, I'll be giving some commentary that may deviate from your patterns as a filmmaker, but that's cool. And I'm just telling you right now that false color is not something I often use, but it is something that has 2 different types of false color. Spectrum is the most common, and then there's this one called airy. But what either of them are doing is assigning colors to the ranges of essentially luminance, such as shadows, highlights, and midtones, and even further gradations of that. And it's a tool in some cases that people use, but that really can lead us into the next category that I propose is the one that is especially useful because you can see reality with zebra stripes to judge exposure and to control highlights being blown out. Less so with this, right? Because it's just goofy and psychedelic. So let's turn it off by pressing close, ironically. And we go to zebra to get that. So we are going to run into our first kind of critique of the product because it turns out that the zebras don't work very well because right now, of course, I have a 95, but if I turn them off, then there we are with no zebras applied, but it turns out I'm not feeding any blown out content. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to blow this sucker out. So let me easily by changing the shutter speed to something outrageous. So right now on my Sony a7 III, there are specular highlights in this shot that are being blown out, and I'm seeing, you know, animated zebra stripes, right? So I'm going to move this up to 100%, which actually is conservative, right? But it should be especially showing up at 75. So the truth is, there are zebra stripes right now on the screen, but I assure you, you cannot see them without, you know, really looking closely. So the flaw of the way that the zebra stripes were graphically designed and non-animated, by the way, is such that it really becomes not a very useful tool for judging exposure that way, okay? So I always like to have it at 95, and if I really look closely, I will see the zebra stripes, And I can see them right now as a very faint, it's almost like it's at, like a, 10% opacity, which is a bad sort of visibility of zebra stripes, but it is there. It's just not very visible on this monitor. So enough boo-hooing about that. But what I do need to do now is bring my exposure back down to normal life. And I had it as a compromise at 1/25. Or even at 1/20th to get the brightness up without jacking up ISO, because there's no movement in this shot. But anyways, that is zebras. So we know how to control it. Whether they fix the problem or whether you can look very closely for those stripes, it remains to be seen. Histogram is something that is another one that I personally don't use much, but they're very popular. They're certainly included with most cameras. And we'll get to the thing that bests it, but we can do both the luminance only, which they call brightness. We can also do RGB, which incorporates color information also in the histogram. And then we can choose a level of transparency. You can see at the most transparent value, it's really hard to see it set aside. We don't know what is in reference to what. So 3 is a pretty bad value. 2 is semi-opaque. You can see behind it, but it's not blocking off the content behind. And then it gets pretty bad once we get to 1. So 2 seems to be a good place for it if we're using it. I don't use RGB histograms if I use them at all. So that's where that all would be. But I'm going to turn, well, I could leave transparency at 2, but I'm going to turn off histograms, especially for now, as we don't want to clutter the screen, and move on to what's actually better. One of the great things about products like this is that it actually can add more capabilities than you thought you had or you did have on your cinema camera, because waveform is a great example. If I turn on the luminance waveform, this is the type of thing we have seen, for example, in the Lumetri scopes in Adobe Premiere Pro. And it's a great tool for looking at the range of exposure, because what it can do is it can say, from 100 down to 0, I should be seeing my darkest content sort of hitting the 0 line when it's true black, and I should be seeing the brightest highlights hit the 100%. And that's how I kind of, maximize my exposure's latitude in post-production, especially saving for later on. When I add the RGB element, then I can see the relative red, green, and blue categories of exposure, which is not only useful for, of course, the implicit value of being able to, find my range of content between shadows, highlights, and midtones, but also if these are all around the same sort of axis or equator line, I should say, if they're all sort of at the same vertical height, that means that we've achieved an overall white balance, if you will, color accuracy. If blue were down but red were higher and so on, what we want to do is we want to adjust our white balance to achieve parity between the 3 different colors. So this is why that sort of thing is useful. What we're also going to see in this tool is this type of tool where we have a set-aside scope, is that we can position it at different places on the screen. It's comical that we could put it in the center. No, we can't actually. That's funny if we could have. But we can move it all around. We can have it over there and there and there and there. So typically we have it right there. And even so, I'm going to turn it off right now. By the way, same issue with transparency, right? So just like we had with the histograms. But again, I'm going to turn it off so we don't clutter things, right? But waveform is oftentimes a good thing to leave on. Moving on to vectorscope, there's maybe less of an argument for including that, but when I turn it on, of course, vectorscopes are implicitly about color and not about luminance, so we don't see any variance on that between 2 types of scopes, but we certainly can set the position everywhere we want it. And we can see also, incidentally, the skin tone line, right? There you can see that reference mark. That's where the skin of all races of the world unite. They all lie on that skin tone line. And so we could look at where the content is and try and nudge it over to there if we were adjusting white balance. So that's usually what that's useful for. But I have to be honest, that's usually more useful a tool in post-production, not in an on-camera monitor on location. So I'm turning it off. Log/HDR, you'll see there, is ghosted out. So why is it ghosted out? The answer is because we aren't feeding it right now any content that's destined for Rec 2020, which is an HDR compatible playback situation. So if I were feeding it that type of signal, then surely that would be on, but I'm not. So ghosted out. And there would be very minor controls in regards to that as it connects with LUTs. So we've gotten a whole category out of the way, so we're moving along in a nice clip for such a long instructional video. And we are into this category that they entitle Focus and Composition. And focus is a pretty small part of this, and it's mostly about, so to speak, composition. And when we talk about composition, we're talking about tools that can help you put things on the screen and where to locate them, right? I already have some loaded because I sort of started off with my desired set of presets, but we'll see how these all work soon. When it comes to single color, this is the most sort of baffling and niche. It gives you the ability to only have the screen showing us one color for the content. So I'm double tapping to get back to the menus, which, by the way, it could have been with a swipe. And again, I always have to navigate back to the prior menu category I was at. I can make it all green, I can make it all blue, or I can just close that function. So that's the ability to have all of your content appear only in one color for what it's worth. I have never had that become a useful tool in my workflow, but maybe you have. Be awfully curious. If you want to put in the comments why you find that useful, let me know. Peaking. Now that is something where there's no downside to always having it on. So you can see right now that it's on. You'll see what it looks like if I turn it off. And there's something peculiar you'll notice right away is that the grid lines, the on-screen graphics, were receiving peaking assistance. And that is truly a product flaw, because what's supposed to be done is that the firmware/OS software, if you will, of this product should treat all on-screen graphics as a separate, if you will, alpha channel to which peaking is not applied or, working on. And so when I turn it on to red, which is the preferred color since red is the farthest away from what we on median see in the real world as opposed to green or blue or white, all of those are trying to apply peaking onto all on-screen graphics, which is, of course, nonsense because we're not ever trying to make on-screen graphics in focus or out of focus. They're implicitly in focus all the time. But what is going on is that it is applying some peaking to some things that we can see in this shot. So if I turn off menus, I'm actually going to take us out of focus so that you can see what is peaked and what isn't. So if I go to the wall, you'll see that the peaking is becoming especially useful in terms of getting me to nail focus on the sort of leaf sculpture on the wall. And then if I rack back into the globe, I guess I draw your attention most down here. You can see that the focus peaking has helped me achieve tack sharp focus on the globe's surface, at least on this part and this part. And there is peaking. What's the point of all this? It's to be a bit critical and to say, back to focus and composition and focus and composition and peaking, is that that's actually with it on strong. It gets even worse if I go to average or weak, where the peaking is almost not showing up at all. So the bottom line is that you definitely want it on strong to even have a shot at peaking working well for you. And then if you have it lower, it's of very little value, and hopefully in a firmware update, they'll be a little bit more liberal in terms of the application of peaking, because it's really not terribly helpful in this the way it's currently implemented. So that's that. Again, no downside to leaving peaking on, though. The alternative, if you find peaking unsatisfactory, FYI, is that in many cameras, if you can output the actual delivery of what the camera's viewfinder is providing. What I mean by that is that I could have set my A7 III to output via its HDMI port its own menus and its own focus peaking and its own application of gamma assist, which is basically applying a LUT. I could do that. That would be a solution to the problem. But what it wouldn't do is it wouldn't give me localized custom control of all of these things. Now I would be camera dependent in that regard. So if you're really having problem with focus peaking on the way it's implemented here, you could resort back to the camera's HDMI output if you set it that way. And then another caveat is sometimes certain modes of camera output via HDMI are ineligible for that direct view of camera graphics. And an example of that typically is UHD. So on the Sony a7 III, it'll only output the menus if you're outputting 1080p at the HDMI port. So these are all of the little nuances that might or might not come into play for you. Moving along to center mark, I also don't see a downside to having that on. You'll see, again, the misnomer of open and close. That means it's currently on. If I press close, you'll see it goes away. It never gets in the way of anything, right? So I'm inclined to always have it on, and I'm inclined to have it be this white color, actually, because it doesn't really need to stand out so much. But just like I have with the other lines that we'll get to later. So I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to move on to the next item, which is safe area. Is especially vintage, and I'm going to go ahead and kind of sneer at it as being, I don't know, fogey, old-timey. Because what that was useful for in the old days, you'll see what just happened is that when I went to 90%, 85%, 80%, safe area's original spirit was, how do we make sure that on old glass boob tube curvy television sets in the analog era, we don't have overscan and unpredictability where some of the fringe edge content is seen by some and not by others, right? So the safe area is one way for that. Another reason is that, I guess safe areas are supposed to be disciplinary so that you make sure that the most important content is in some certain safe area. But I think we're all kind of past that, so leaving it off, can't go wrong. Mark ratio is something that is, I've gotten into trouble for this actually. I think in my other Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K video, I got a lot of comments about saying, lay off the hipsters, right? Well, I'm not saying it's just hipsters, but it's a kind of a classic example of how there are people who want to shoot indie mumblecore films, for example, in scope aspect, which is when it's cropping off the top and the bottom, basically throwing away a lot of sensor data so that you can have black bars at the top and bottom. So I don't go for that, but a lot of people do, and I respect that. Unless it's a mumblecore comedy, okay? So when this happens, though, we can see here that there's options for transparency, low and high, right? Well, you're seeing it's not changing anything. So this is the first example of something where you actually can't quite prejudge what it's going to look like until you leave the menus and then go to the full view. So once I do that, you can see that it's actually blocking off those portions of the image, and that's a good thing. So when I swipe back to go to the menus, once again, unfortunately, I have to navigate all the way back there to mark ratio. I had it on low transparency. If I had it on high transparency, that's really preferable, right? Because you can peekaboo behind what's being blocked in your final edit. It's still recording, by the way, in your camera or on your recorder, all this stuff. But you're able to compose your shot to account for the fact that the audience shouldn't be able to see all of that when you're in your final edit. So that's what that setting does. And you've already heard me express my opinion about not using 16:9, so I'm just turning it off. And there we are, back to our native aspect ratio. As to grid lines, you can see that I currently have on the rule of thirds 3:3. I can turn it off too, and it's gone. And yeah, applying peaking to the on-screen graphics, not cool, but whatever. We can ignore it. Rule of thirds is something very controversial. I'm not going to get into it, but I also don't see a downside to always having this on. I have an attitude about this. I'm not Sam Ismail shooting Mr. Robot. I'm not Pavlovsky shooting Ida, the Polish foreign film, where things were located down here all the time or whatever. In general, 99% of all cinematography diligently puts eye lines either at this juncture or this juncture, depending on where people are facing. So here or here. And this is especially true when you're shooting documentary interviews. So the rule of third grid line is awfully important to kind of constantly be badgering you with reminders. So I personally don't mind leaving them up all the time, and that's how you do it. You can go all the way up to 8:8. Another reason that grid lines have been useful is in the effects, the special visual effects world, or for that matter, when you want to reconstruct a shot, needed to leave a scene and come back again, this would be a particularly more precise way of really sort of nailing down the exact composition that you had in prior circumstances, but I'm staying at 3:3. So leaving that and moving on to audio meters, This could look a little elusive until you realize that when it says left and right, it doesn't mean left audio channel, right audio channel. It means, do I want this meter to be either off or located on the left side of the screen, bottom, or located on the right side of the screen, bottom. Moving along. Oh, I'm going to keep it on the left, by the way, to keep it out of the way of any scopes that might show up there or distinguished. So we already did LUT. So we are able to go to our second to last menu. Moving along in an OK clip, we are at aspect ratio under this major category called display setting. And in the aspect ratio category, we're essentially dealing with a couple of things, but mainly the fact that, again, the monitor is, I'm going to go back to full screen view, is 1920 pixels, 1200 pixels. They give you a little more room for whatever other reasons that you might need it. But you see how there's sort of a black line at the top, black line at the bottom? That's because it's giving a true sensor readout of the 16:9 source image that's coming out of my Sony a7 III. Swiping back in, I have it on auto right now because it's looking at the source image and matching it with the aspect ratio of the source image. I could force it to be 4:3, but then what's happening there is you could actually call this whole category, rather than aspect ratio, you could call it pixel aspect ratio would be a more accurate way of putting it, because this is not 1:1 anymore. This is not a 1:1 pixel aspect ratio. It's squeezing the image, right? There are rare circumstances when that could be useful. But one example of a circumstance that could be useful is if you have one of those cool, funky anamorphic lenses. An anamorphic lens unnaturally stretches an image. And I'm kind of doing this wrong because you'd probably counteract it with the opposite. But you can see how there may be circumstances where in a monitoring context you want to be manipulating the stretch of an image to deal with whatever lens that you're applying onto the image. So in most cases, 99% of you will be going to this aspect ratio category and leaving it at auto, dealing with the image that arrives. Moving on to the next category is display flip. This was, I'm sure that they knew this when they made it, that they didn't fully implement this. Did they give up because they were rushing to market? Yeah, probably. Is it a technical impossibility? Definitely no. Other monitor manufacturers fix this problem, but here's what it is. You'll see it happen as soon as I do it. I could horizontally flip. Oh no, right? So they didn't make the menus go in the right direction. So boo-hoo. So I'm going to close that. Close meaning, again, off. I can vertically flip also. So, same problem. I'm going to close that. So what do we have here? Well, with horizontal flip, we have another, so to speak, problem. It's a minor one because I'm not one of those vloggers who likes to yammer into the camera and be able to turn my monitor around and see myself and whatever. So if I wanted to have it do a sort of mirror image so that left is left and right is right, it doesn't do that, okay? It just really does a true horizontal flip. So that's the first critique. I don't care. The vertical flip thing also, of course, we had the text problem, but vertical flip is of limited use because of the fact that unfortunately, there's no 1/4" 20 socket at the other side, the normal top of the chassis. There is, on the other hand, a 1/4" 20 on the side. So one could see vertical flip being useful if you were kind of needing to put it on the other side of your camera, and then you activate the horizontal flip. But yeah, it's not very useful if the words are backwards, because who among us can actually interpret backwards writing? So this is another thing that I'm sure if there's enough demand and if this product succeeds, which I'd like to see it happen, that they will inevitably issue a firmware update to solve that problem. So I have those kept off for now. Moving along to zooming. Zooming is a function of also pretty limited use, and here's why. The only way to get to the zooming function, even though we're going to learn about shortcuts later, the only way to get to it is, unfortunately, to go dig into the menus and to go to zooming and then to drag this slider. So I'm dragging it in, dragging it in, dragging it in, dragging it in. Can I move around? No. So why is the image going crazy right now? It's because I mentioned before, the only way that this product interprets any swiping movement is that you're wanting to go back and forth between menus and not, right? That's the problem. So the zooming function only zooms in to the center, and then only does it by going back and forth to this menu bar. So we're going to find this pretty unuseful going forward, but we'll get to another function that may become more useful. This says pixel to pixel, and when I turn it on, I think, but have not verified, that this is a way of enforcing one-to-one. So if I were feeding the monitor a source, I can't demonstrate this right now, but if I were feeding the monitor a higher resolution source than what the monitor is capable of showing, then by turning this on, it would be an easy way to punch in so that it's the monitor's own resolution is giving us a windowed mode into the larger picture represented by the source material, right? But since I'm feeding, for this practical purpose, a 1080p image into the monitor, this one-to-one isn't giving any evident change in magnification. But it would look doubly magnified if I were giving it a true UHD source. So that's what that's all about. And we'll get to the 9-grid later on, which is the final solution to this problem that I've already explained. So HV delay is another somewhat nebulous one. It's a problem that doesn't apply to modern filmmakers in almost all use cases, where we would have some sorts of studio encounters of H delay, V delay, HV delay. I would leave it to you. If you want to comment on this, then I'll be, all the better, for all the wiser. We'll all be all the wiser if we know what this means, but this does not come up in my life, and I doubt it will in yours. Moving along to something useful, though, with, once again, an unuseful use of terms. Close means nothing. Open means take a picture, right? So if I tap this, it doesn't look like much, but what has actually just happened is that it's stored a picture onto the thumb drive. Did I mention? Thumb drive doesn't need to stay connected all the time. It's just for loading content, such as firmware updates and LUTs, but those things stay in the memory. But anyways, I can then take my USB drive and then, use that JPEG as like a set still. That's pretty great, because sometimes when we're shooting, we need to do a quick kind of mini daily, and the mini daily still frame is much easier to acquire this way than having to offload an entire hour-long or gigantic gigabyte-long clip and then go navigate using an editing application to the spot where we want to grab the still frame. This is a pretty easy way to do that, especially if you're applying a LUT already so that it's converted back from flat color space. Okay, so moving along to battery notification, this is another example, just like the sort of transparency and opacity things that we saw before with the framing stuff, composition stuff, where you're not going to see the effects of this being on until you leave this screen, and then there it is. So the battery indication shows you how much battery you have left. I have an NP F750 battery on the back of this sled. That's a Sony mid-sized standard battery, and it performs kind of just okay. I think it could do better. I have this at 25% brightness right now because of the fact that it would otherwise blow out the video capture of this session. And even then, it's consuming a lot of battery. I think this could last about 2 hours with low lightness. And then if I turned it on full blast, I'm afraid I might only get an hour. But I'm not the one to do those types of tests because they're boring. Okay, so we're back at display setting, and we've gone through almost all of them except for this final one that gives us a little hope when it comes to the important necessity on any monitor, right, of being able to punch in. So this is the one useful tool, finally, where we can punch in, not only because it's a better interface, but also because, and we can navigate around, but also because we'll be able to get here eventually through a shortcut, unlike the others. So it works very simply. You just tap any of these portions of the image to turn it into a one-to-one representation of that portion of the image. So I want to, let's say I want to go down here and read or at least nail focus on this sort of badge. So you can see when I did that, I was able to punch in, and then I can pull focus even a little better if I thought I could. But at this resolution, that's about as best as I can do. When I tap it again, then it goes back to the full screen, right? Or I could have just moved from there to there to there and so on. So that's how that works. And turning it off is just tapping it again. That is what we'll use more than any other of the features for punching in, zooming in essentially. Okay. So we've arrived at system configuration, which sounds sort of bland and only need to do it once, but actually could be useful for some things that you'll tweak in the field ongoing. The first thing to look at is this menu config general. They could have called this general, actually, because system config and menu config sound too similar. This is the first kind of general setting where it basically says, should we have a sort of temporary view of the menus and have them auto close, or should we, and how much time should that take, or should we not, right? So close, once again, poorly named, actually means off. And right now I have it set to what I think you all will want to set it at. Why? Because it's so easy to leave the menus. There are other types of devices where you have to hit a hot button or a physical button to do so. It's so easy just to tap once and to leave that I can't see the value in having menus auto close on you. So we leave that at its close value. And then here we choose between languages. Given the language I'm talking to you right now, I think you're going to have it on English. It's pretty unlikely that you're going to use the next menu item category called color, because the goal of a good cinematographer is to be feeding a monitor like this good color information and exposure information in the first place. So it's even misnamed color when it includes things like brightness and sharpness, contrast, and saturation, right? So you can see that it has an effect on all of this, but of what value? Certainly very little, because none of this stuff that you do here is going to be recorded anyways into the camera, what the camera is recording. So, you know, of what value? If you have really bad white balance, then you can compensate for really bad white balance, for example. Well, actually, you can't because there's no color controls. If you have low exposure, then the problem is something that you need to fix in your camera, not here at the monitor level. So, yeah, I'm not going to ramble on, but you see what I'm getting at there. It's backlight is where the brightness will matter, and we'll get there in a second. This actually is kind of important, though, because color temperature is not to be confused with the color temperature of the source material. That is, of course, its own very precise and deeply important science when it comes to accurately capturing, you know, digital cinematography. It's the curse of any cinematographer and the biggest nightmare, right? So it's an interesting question to ask, why is the default, I haven't changed from the default, why is the camera's default 6500 Kelvin? 6500 Kelvin is, if you will, this is crazy, isn't it? It's not warm in the traditional sense, because when we say warm in the kind of, you know, how do I say, the cinematographer, a crude dude lingo, warm it up, dude. That usually means actually a much lower Kelvin value, because much lower Kelvin values are orangey, right? And then in the real world, if we are outdoors, then of course 5600 Kelvin is the standard sort of outdoors color temperature. When we set it to 6500, what we're basically doing is we're overcompensating. So I guess there's a limit to how much I can faithfully and accurately explain what's going on here. But 6500 happens to be a good number because when you have blended light sources, but in particular when you're outdoors, and let's also assume for the sake of argument that there are lots of situations, if not the majority of situations, when you're going to use this camera in an outdoor environment where you need a bigger screen because it's hard outside to judge from a tiny little viewfinder, you know, all kinds of categories of cinematography, right? So you want it at this setting when you're outside is one way to put it. If I come down lower, you can see it's making it more orangey. And so that's what's going on there. But I'm just going to kind of leave it there, but note that you can also adjust values here in a custom context, or in a customized way, the relative red, green, and blue. So all of this feeds back, though, into the wisdom that none of this is going to change what's being recorded. And so there's not a lot of situations where you're going to be too stressed out about nailing the perfect white balance and the perfect color temperature at the monitoring level. But what you'll probably end up doing is just, instead of thinking too hard about this and getting a headache, just punch through each of these three presets and find the one that you like while you're in the field, and then just move on. So let's leave it at that. In fact, I should have just said that in the first 30 seconds. Backlight, though, is something you're going to go to a lot. For this video, I set it at 25, and the reason I set it at 25 is because I think I said this earlier with regard to battery life, that it would have totally blown out if I wanted to include more of the background in this particular capture for my Blackmagic shooting the screen, right? But you can see how crazy high it goes. So this is at full 100%, and then 100% on this particular model is 1,000 nits, which is the way that we measure total brightness. I remember the old days it used to be lux, L-U-X. In particular, we used to rate tube-driven cameras that way, how many luxes of sensitivity. Anyways, I'm going to take it back down to 25-ish. But you can see you can also punch to standard is a preset of 50, high is a preset of 100. Okay, so I'm going back to 25-ish. Okay. Moving along to the sound category, the on says that the internal speaker of this product, which is not relevant right now because I don't have this mic attached to the source that's feeding this monitor, has a certain volume level, right? So I can have that at a default, but I can also always mute it. And that also applies to the feature of this product where underneath the chassis there is a little, over here, there's a little 1/8 inch stereo headphone jack. So this will also control that and will auto turn off the speaker if you plug the headphone jack in here, as most consumer electronic products do. So how useful is that? Seems to me very little, because one of the things that you would probably do is you'd use the source speaker where there's zero latency inside of your camera if it has it, and then listen through that rather than through here. I guess, though, if there were a long HDMI cord and this is sort of a remote monitoring location, then certainly this sort of audio monitoring would be relevant. But in most cases, for zero latency, you'd want your headphones plugged into the source camera, you'd want the speaker of the source camera playing, and you wouldn't be relying on the one in here, and you just turn it to mute. So I have it on mute now. So the all-important hotkey category is both, what can I say? It's both a blessing, but also terribly limited, but it's the best we can do with making this product pragmatic and practical. So there are 3 buttons at top, and they have labeled into them. Not easy to read, I'm afraid. I wish they'd just make gigantic labels for these things no matter how it looks instead of trying to look cool. So if you squint hard enough, you can see that the first of the 3 buttons, hard buttons, is exit. The second is F1, and the third is F2, represented by red, yellow, and blue. Red, yellow, blue. So this exit button actually means exit when you're using these buttons to navigate around the menus without using the touchscreen. But for the purposes of hotkeys, while you're in full screen view, pressing the red button can be assigned to any of this potpourri of functions. So I decided to have, and there are defaults that the monitor comes with. I decided to have it so when you press exit and it becomes highlighted, if you will, then you can move around to any of these, right? And you can have it so that it basically toggles on or off, in most cases, the function. And then when I press it again, it sort of saved it. Well, actually, if I move along to the next item, press OK, it's now saved. So when I go out of this view and I press the exit button, you can see how it's actually, in this case, cycling through the colors to off, right? I'm not crazy about that, actually. I'd rather that it just honor my color choice and either just toggle it on or off, but c'est la vie. You can see, actually, that's with it on white peaking, and now it's off. I'm tapping it one more time, and it's turned it back on. So it's cycled back to red peaking. It's not cycling through the strength, which needs to be strongest all the time anyway, but it's doing something, right? So back to system configuration. Nope. Back to, what am I doing here? Menu configuration and hotkey. So I've got exit assigned to peaking. I've got F1 assigned to whatever the hell I want. I decided to have F1 assigned to LUT because then I can, as I hook different cameras in, or if I want to turn off the Rec. 709 conversion, or very importantly, if I'm not shooting in log mode and I want to turn off the LUT, then I have this ability to use one tap of the F1 key to toggle the LUTs. And then I have F2 set to pixel, but you know what? I'm going to change my mind here. I'm going to change that to, what did I say earlier? Which of these? Uh-oh. We might get, I'm getting angry. Don't we want to be able to go to 9 grid? Because that's the best way to zoom in. My goal is to have a hotkey that gets me to a zooming in at all. And so I can't do it. Isn't that a bummer? Especially since you can't pinch to zoom, because all pinching actions are assumed as a swipe, which is then assumed as a menu trigger. So the best I could do is put it on pixel to pixel. And since it's set to pixel, if I'm feeding this a UHD source in this example, right? So if I were 4K resolution, by pressing this button, it would toggle and punch in to a 1-to-1 pixel ratio of the source image, because this is like a windowed mode, if you will, because this is 1920 by 1200, right? So it would say, I'm going to treat this big 4K source image as, and only look at a 1920 by, what was the number? 1920 by 1200 portion of that UHD image. That's what that toggles between. So it would give me a zooming capability, but unfortunately there's no hotkey available under all of these choices to punch in. So that is a huge drawback, feature flaw of this product, because at least among one of these, there should have been the ability to punch in. The only way to punch in currently is to go to display setting and 9 grid, or if you must, zooming pixel to pixel, okay? So, bummer. So that's how hotkey works. Reset is what it sounds like. Kind of risky, isn't it? There might be a warning after you press OK, but that means everything I did, forget it, let's start over again. And then lastly, update is an opportunity to, from the, when you mount the USB drive, if you're able to download an update. Another critique of this is that the manual doesn't really tell you where to even look for a firmware update. So I really don't know whether one has been issued or one is forthcoming or anything. There's no sort of easy way to do that. It would have been nice, for example, for them to say, go to this site or something. But anyways, the manual, included paper manual, doesn't tell you this information. So it remains to be seen, but I'll certainly update this video if it does look like there's a firmware update in the caption. Lastly, status. So status is only reporting. There's no parameters you can change here. But the information is very useful because it really is telling us what the frame rate is of the source material, which can affect the choices we make in terms of the environment with flickering, shutter speed, things like that. It's telling us what the backlight strength is, basically. So I'm only at 1/4, so I'm even below 25, as I mentioned. Whoops, there was my single tap to leave the menus. Back to status. Speaker volume, even though it's muted, it would have been nice for them to tell us that it's muted. Color temperature of the monitor and what it's firing at. The source resolution is 1080p. If it had been higher, then when I did the 1-to-1, it would have punched in. Scan mode, line by line, I believe what that's telling us is progressive scan as opposed to interlaced. I can't confirm that though, but that's, confirming that. It's compatible. I could tell from the spec sheet that it's compatible with interlaced sources, so you would see that indicated there. Aspect ratio is set to auto, which is a good place to be unless we want to force it into something because of an anamorphic lens, for one example. And finally, you can see the firmware version, and perhaps that's telling me my serial number or not. I don't care about masking it out. You won't see me masking stuff like that out. What am I afraid of, right? So that concludes, I believe, our entire journey through how this damn thing works. But I say damn thing, but I'm actually really happy with it. I think it's a really great product. It was worth the money. It's only about less than $250, which is quite a steal compared to what Atomos is charging for their 1000 nit monitors. They do have a monitor-only device, but it is true, you are not getting, just to clarify in case you assumed this, there is no recording capability in this monitor. It is only for literally monitoring. But these days, I remember when the Atomos Shogun came out, which added 10-bit 422 capability to the GH4, and we all thought that monitor/recorders were going to take over the industry. Didn't work out that way. Cameras are catching up enough with internal recording where the virtue of having a recorder in the monitor is sort of receded. I will conclude, though, with just noting that outside of the menus and outside of the on-screen functions, the way that the dial at the top works is to be able to navigate through menus once you're there. By default, as you can see, it's applying focus peaking, even if that isn't it. You can change the volume level if you aren't doing anything else. So I don't like that. So it's an example of how I wish I could have assigned a function to the dial so that it changes some parameter instead of volume level of the speaker. Once you're in the menus, though, and I can double tap or swipe to get there, you can see how it's navigating through functions, right? And then I can tap exit to leave, right? But when I'm back into the menus, whoops, that's toggling because of my settings, right? That's toggling too. When I go back into the menus, once I'm in the menus, I can be using these buttons to navigate around further. So in other words, they have provided you a last resort way to navigate through things like this, and then pushing down on the dial in order to be able to select different things without using the touch screen. I don't know what situation that would call for that besides the fact that touchscreens being touch capacitive with gloves on or other situations, maybe it's sweaty hands, I don't know, where the touchscreen is not working the way you want it to. So the bottom line that I'm saying here is that you'll probably find yourself using the dial very little, and that you'll find yourself using these three buttons as hotkeys more than you are as an exit function from the menu and for selecting different menu items, because you can do that by hand. That's all to say about the Bestview R7 monitor. I'm not the kind of person who issues final judgments, but I think by watching this, if you've gotten this far, you've got a solid view of what it's capable of, some of its shortcomings. You can see how important that is to you compared to what you're paying, and finally reach a decision about whether this is for you.